sort of, end of term-ish, and people are largely demob happy thereabouts. Perhaps I shouldn't have made mock examination results so available so early today. Kind of use that as a bargaining chip. So I think we're a bit light, aren't we, in terms of attendance? But hopefully a few more people will turn up. So this is our second. Well, it's I think we have one more seminar in the series to run next Tuesday. But delighted tonight to have Rebecca here, who's talking to us on critical pedagogies in higher education in Ghana, Botswana, and what's the other country?
Kenya.
And Kenya. Rebecca's from UCL, Institute of Education in London, and so normally we have about an hour and a half, so speak for as long as you like, maybe leave half an hour for questions or so, or make it as interactive as you wish. And the format is quite fluid sometimes, so we don't quite mind. I'll pass on to you, Rebecca.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for coming out in the bitter cold and the potentiality of a snow. David and I had a lot of back and forth. Should I come? Will I get stranded? I'm not sure. But ultimately, I'm from the Boston area. A little snow doesn't put me off. I'm a little more worried about what this country does when it snows. But hopefully, I will get back just fine. But it's great to see you all anyway. And hopefully, we will. I will. Essentially what I'm reporting on today is a bit of a work in progress, as I think most of the Raising Learning Outcomes projects are, and that none of us are completely finished. Well, maybe one, but most of us are not completely finished. But what I'd like to take you through is a project that I am co-leading with colleagues at UCL, as well as colleagues from University of Cape Coast in Ghana, from Strathmore University in Kenya, and from the University of Botswana in Botswana. So hopefully the plan for today is to take you through sort of the rationale for the study, why we decided to focus on what we're focusing on, a little bit about the methodology, and then a bit of a sort of progress report as to where we are and what's coming up next. So I'll start with the heavy content, and then I would definitely like to leave it open for questions as we go through. So we are the Pedagogies for Critical Thinking project. We do have a whole second part of that, innovation and outcomes in African higher education, but we refer to ourselves mostly as Pedagogies for Critical Thinking. So we are one of the projects with a 3-year duration, but I went ahead and had a baby in the middle of it, so we had maternity leave, so it's turned out to be a 4-year duration, in that we started in April of 2015 and we'll be finishing up next March. The baby coincided quite well with the way that the research was running, in that we had some delays getting off the ground, so actually it's worked out quite well that essentially we have a 3-year project over a 4-year span. But it's a big team. Tristan McCowan, who's my colleague at UCL, and I are co-PIing, even though officially, I don't believe the ESRC officially acknowledges co-PIs, but we do run the project as a two. And we have 2 other colleagues from UCL working with us, Kane Rolliston, who is also with us in the Education and International Development group at UCL, and Andy Tolmie, who's in the Psychology group. And then we have a structure with a team lead in each of our country contexts and a research officer in each of our country contexts. And one of the reasons we've done that is that's what we need in order to get the work done on the ground, but also we specifically chose 3 either current PhD students or rising PhD students in the 3 countries to work as the research officers as a sort of capacity building element of the project. Particularly given that we're focusing on universities, it seemed really important that we bring some new researchers into the project and sort of work with them to develop their own research skills as a part of working on the initiative. So we're an outlier in the Raising Learning Outcomes scheme, in that most of the other projects are focusing on primary or secondary levels of education. We are looking at tertiary education. And so I thought it might be useful to sort of set the context a bit, because I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with the higher ed landscape in sub-Saharan Africa. Some slightly different situations than you would face at primary or secondary level. So particularly in terms of the fact that our project is focusing on teaching, there's a few sort of contextual things that you want to keep in the back of your mind when we think about what we're looking at and why. So in terms of the global, we know that everywhere in the world we have an expansion of higher education going on, often referred to as massification of higher education, and that In countries like the UK, the US, we are really approaching huge numbers of students going to higher education, 70%, 80%, 90% in some countries, continuing on to some form of higher education after their secondary schooling. In sub-Saharan Africa, the numbers are much lower. For the continent as a whole, it's about 8% gross enrollment rate. But the fact that 15 years ago it was 4%, that's a doubling. And when you actually think about population growth over that same period, it's a massive expansion in numbers of students going to university. And a lot of that is driven by student demand, belief that higher education is a ticket to social mobility, of course, which is something that you see in countries around the world, but also related to the fact that particularly over the last 15 years, there's been a real focus on sort of bringing higher education back into the conversation as a critical engine for development in the context of the knowledge economy. So there's focus from national governments and increasingly so international agencies after a period of moving away from higher education back to support for higher education. So essentially we have a lot more students going to higher education with the idea that they are going to be learning the skills that are crucial for the knowledge economy. So if we take of that as the international context, then we hone in on what that means for institutions. Well, what that means is particularly given this knowledge economy justification, there's been more of a focus on student learning outcomes. And that seems like something that always should have been there, but actually hasn't been. So when you look at the literature on African higher ed, for many years, a lot of the focus was on infrastructure, some focus on research, some focus on faculty, not a whole lot on what students were learning at university. But now that we have many, many, many more students coming into the system with sort of lofty ambitions for what they can do with their higher education degrees, there has been more of a focus on student learning, and as a result, more of a focus on what's happening in classrooms and university pedagogy. To be fair, this is also something that you could see happening in high-income contexts, and the fact that we've had learning at universities for millennia, but or anyway, hundreds of years, thousands of years, but not a whole lot of focus on pedagogy until the last maybe 50 years, 40 years in the US, less than that in Europe, and certainly in the African context, there's been very little work done on pedagogy. As a result of this, if you go all the way down into what actually institutions are doing in response to this pressure, you do see beginnings of efforts to enhance teaching and learning on university campuses. There are efforts to address challenges to learning and teaching, and related to that, in some universities, not all by any means, but in some, you're starting to see some academic development, faculty development type initiatives to try and support faculty to improve their teaching practice. So that's important context, I think, for what it is that we're hoping to do. But in terms of our specific study rationale, we're looking at critical thinking, and we will take some time later on to talk about what we mean by that. But to start with, just to say that most universities, if you look in their strategy documents, they refer to critical thinking as a learning outcome that they think is important, that students will learn at their time at university. You can see that everywhere in the world, really. Definitely in the US, definitely all over Europe, increasingly so in East Asia, and across Africa as well. But we know from literature on higher education generally that just going to university does not necessarily improve your critical thinking skills. We definitely have evidence of this, of students not improving in that particular arena after 3 or 4 years at university. At the same time, we also do know quite a bit about what the sort of conditions are that are likely to lead to the development of such skills, specifically the kinds of teaching that are likely to foster them, and perhaps more importantly, the kinds of teaching that are not likely to foster critical thinking skills. So we do know quite a bit about what it is that we would want to do in university classrooms if we wanted to improve critical thinking skills. The dilemma is that almost all of the evidence comes from high-income contexts, specifically Western contexts. And yet, as I mentioned before, in terms of the context, you look across universities in Africa, and many are developing interventions. They're setting up teaching and learning centers. They're doing faculty development programming. They're bringing in different kinds of teaching, all based on that evidence, that body of evidence that comes from high-income, largely Western contexts. And yet we know that teaching and learning are cultural processes, so there is some concern with the fact that we're relying on evidence from other contexts when attempting to improve pedagogy within African universities. So this is the gap that we're really hoping to start to address with this study, which is something about what kinds of pedagogy in African contexts can help to improve critical thinking skills at the university level. And before this particular study, the only study that had been done on that was my doctoral work that looked at Rwanda. So in a way, the Rwandan study, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about it because it kind of underpins the rationale and the methodology for the project that we're doing currently under the RLO scheme. So the Rwanda work was a cross-sectional study, which basically means I looked at first and fourth year students at the same moment in time. Largely due to the constraints of a doctoral thesis, I wasn't able to follow students for many, many years. But what I did was I identified 220 students, a random sample, at the 3 most prestigious universities in Rwanda. And I gave them a critical thinking assessment. I'm going to spend some time talking about that assessment later on, but just for now, suffice to say it was based on an assessment that's been used in other contexts, but adapted for use in Rwanda. Gave that test to about half of these 220 were first years, half were fourth year students to see if there was any difference in their critical thinking ability, and then also did some qualitative case studies at the participating universities to try and get a sense of what was happening in the classrooms. In general, the students did not perform particularly well on this assessment. Not universally, there were some who did, so it wasn't a question of the test being too hard, some did very well. But generally, the students performed quite low. And more importantly, there was no statistically significant difference between the first year and the fourth year students in the sample. So although it's not exactly as good as following students through, there was some indicative evidence that students were not leaving university with any better critical thinking skills than their first year counterparts. And also, no significant difference found in terms of fields of study in general, in the study as a whole. Then when we look at the qualitative results, I think this is where we really see some interesting things. So first of all, if you look at the literature, as I mentioned, we have this large body of literature on the kinds of pedagogy, the kinds of things, kinds of conditions that universities can do to foster critical thinking skills. I expected, and I should say that my work in Rwanda was based on the fact that I had lived and worked teaching university students in Rwanda for 2 years, and prior to this. So my assumption from my own professional work was that I was going to find that most of these conditions were not present. In fact, I found the opposite. All of the universities in the sample were in their teaching and learning, had recent teaching and learning and assessment strategies, first of all. And second of all, those strategies were being implemented. And third of all, those strategies included all the things you'd expect to find. So what was going on? When you actually went into the classroom, what was going on was, yes, these practices were being implemented, but they were being adapted to such a point that they were hardly recognizable from the original intention. So one example, so we know from the literature that one of the ways that critical thinking can be supported, developed, is through working collaboratively with others. And the reason why is as you discuss things, as you work on projects as a group, you have a chance to air your own ideas, you hear other people's ideas in that discursive process, you learn to critique your own thoughts, other thoughts. That helps with the development of critical thinking skills. So there's a large literature that says things like group discussion, group projects are helpful in terms of supporting critical thinking development. And indeed, in all 6 of the faculties in the study, they were using lots of group projects and group discussion. But when you actually look to see what nature those group projects took, what tended to happen was a group of maybe 6 would be put together. The students would be given a task that any one student could easily complete by themselves. They were not particularly large tasks. The students would meet together after class. They would together identify who was the strongest student. That student would do the work. The other students would maybe contribute something towards the photocopying or something like that. That was the group project. Students knew it was happening, faculty knew it was happening. And there was no concern with that because we go back to the fact that teaching and learning is a cultural process. So when you work in a communitarian, collaborative, collectivist type of a culture, there is no concern. The students were not concerned. The one who did the work felt very happy to be contributing in that way to the team. The ones who didn't do the work were very happy to be contributing the way they were into the team, and the faculty was fine with it as well. So this is a very, one second and then I'll answer the question. It's a very good example of an adaptation process where technically there was a group project, but it was being implemented in a way that worked for the faculty, worked for the students, but was not necessarily going to lead to a development of critical thinking skills. And if that was the intention of implementing that kind of assessment structure, that objective was perhaps not being met. The objective of dealing with huge numbers of students in a class and having to mark fewer assignments was definitely being met, but the other one was not. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, having spent the past 10 years in Rwanda,
Yeah.
back and forth. Two schools where I get a sense there is progress. So I'm curious where you focus. Certainly the Kigali School of Finance, which I've lectured at and which works with Saeed, I certainly get the sense from what I've seen the evidence with the students, there is progress. You know, I hold an annual Dragons Day and I make them do their stuff. The other school that I know also does well is the School of Architecture, where...
Hold that thought.
Okay. So my question to you is that, are you looking at some of the more narrow silos in tertiary education and seeing a difference in the results where maybe they are partnering with outsiders versus the generalists, which is where I suspect you're focusing, if I'm going to guess, probably wrong.
That wasn't where I was focusing. No, but you're foreshadowing my results, which is very good. Thank you. The three institutions that I worked with was the National University of Rwanda, the School of Finance and Banking, and the Kigali Institute of Science and Technology. The overall sample was a random sample from those three institutions. The case study parts, because the National University of Rwanda is so large and there was no way that I as an individual doctoral student could do a full case study of every faculty, so I chose 3 faculties at NUR and 3 faculties at KIST. The reason I couldn't do SFB is we had incredibly low turnout on students coming to the assessment for various complicated logistical reasons, mostly because internships were happening at the time that I was there. So the sample ended up being largely KIST and NUR students, so I decided to focus the case studies, which was a shame because I knew from working in Rwanda that SFB probably was going to have some quite different results. But in terms of the NUR and KIST faculties, I chose 2 faculties at the National University that matched, that were basically the same academic discipline as so KIST only has 3 faculties, so I did all 3 faculties at KIST. At NUR, I looked at the faculty of, I'm gotta get the names right, Science, which is similar to this faculty of Applied Science, the Faculty of Engineering, which is similar to the Faculty of Engineering, and the largest social science faculty at NUR, and then the third at KIST was the Faculty of Architecture. So the 5 of the 6 was 2 of the 3 at KIST, and all 3 at NUR was where I was finding this adaptation process. But there was an outlier, and as you guessed, the outlier was architecture. And what was happening in architecture was really interesting. First of all, none of this adaptation stuff that I mentioned was found, in that they were doing things at absolutely the way the literature suggests, quote unquote, you should. But most importantly, there was also evidence of impact. So there weren't enough students from architecture in my overall sample to do statistical analysis, but I was able to do qualitative analysis of the assessment responses. And there was definitely more sophisticated critical thinking ability being demonstrated by the 4th year architecture students. But also crucially, when I did student interviews, there was very clearly deeper approaches to learning, more engagement with learning also happening in architecture. And there's lots of things, I'm not presenting really on the Rwanda work today, although I'm happy to answer questions about it. But the reason why this is important in terms of our project is one of my frustrations when I read the literature on higher ed in Africa, specifically when I read the literature on pedagogy, is there's this block narrative. There's this block deficit narrative that all universities in Africa teach by rote. All universities in Africa hand out yellow notes, and that's the way they teach. All universities in Africa, X, Y, and Z. And I knew from my time in Rwanda, but specifically also from this study, that that was absolutely not the case. So we basically, looking at the overall conclusions, that yes, in the overall sample, students did not seem to be improving in their critical thinking ability, despite a lot of focus on it from the ministry, a lot of focus by the individual institutions, a lot of work being done on teaching and learning and changing strategies, changing assessment types, changing ways that they teach. I mean, just the fact that every single faculty member I talked to used group projects, had open-ended questions in their assessments, etc. There had been a lot of work done and a lot of change. However, not a lot of impact for most of them. But the other key conclusion was this outlier faculty, if you will. And yes, the Faculty of Architecture has had a lot of international involvement, but it also was not dominated by people from one place. It was quite an international group, which you can find in other faculties.
You mean Michael Murphy didn't dominate what was going on?
No, not entirely. No, it was represented, I think, think there were 12 countries represented in the academic faculty, which you can see in other faculties in Rwanda as well, without the same results. So something was happening and the students were benefiting. So there are really three main things coming out of this study that we wanted to look at in our study. So first of all, I was sure it was the case that there were other pockets of innovation where people were trying to change the way teaching was done. I was sure that some of them would have some positive impact, and that could tell us something about the kinds of pedagogy that is more impactful in the African context. Or in some African contexts anyway. And then hopefully, if we could find some examples of places where things had changed, we could look at what it was within the institution that was allowing that change to happen, or at least not blocking it from happening. So we are doing this work now in 3 countries. Thought it probably was worth spending a few minutes talking about why we chose these 3. Well, we basically wanted to choose 3 countries that had enough similarities, so the obvious one being that these are all English-speaking countries originally based on a British model of higher education, although there has been some changes in all 3. Another crucial thing is that there had to be a higher education system that was well enough developed that they were spending time thinking about teaching and learning. Personally, I believe teaching and learning needs to be developed from the very beginning, but there are plenty of contexts where it's a big enough deal to get students at all into buildings that are not falling down that there isn't a whole lot of conversation about teaching and learning. So all 3 of these contexts absolutely have large higher education systems and that have put a lot of thought and time into teaching and learning. There are, of course, some crucial differences. The main one being the relative resource difference between Botswana and Ghana and Kenya. A, because Botswana has diamonds at its disposal and therefore quite a high GDP, but B, it's a population of 2 million. And the difference between a population of 2 million and a population of 44 million when it comes to running a public university system is massive. So in terms of GDP per capita per student at the public universities in Rwanda, Botswana, we're talking about a lot more money available than these 2. So that's the main difference. It's also a much smaller sector with fewer institutions. But otherwise, we felt it was a good profile of places in terms of telling us something about universities that are trying to improve their pedagogy. So basically, going back to what came out of the questions remaining at the end of the Rwanda study, what we're hoping to do with this is to sort of further expand what we do know about pedagogical innovation happening in the African context. We know it's happening. There's not much written about it, so just that is important. But second of all, more importantly, to think about of those pedagogical reforms, innovations, attempts at change, whether any of them are having an effect on student critical thinking ability, and if so, to better understand the process of pedagogical change that happens within institutions. Because I would say the major thing about the Faculty of Architecture is that it was a new faculty. So architecture had never been taught in Rwanda before, ever. So when they had to create the faculty, there were no Rwandan faculty members who had been trained in Rwanda who could teach because it had never been taught there before. So by necessity, it was a faculty that was set up and developed by people who had been trained elsewhere. And as I was saying, it was a very diverse group who came with lots of different ideas and worked together to come up with their pedagogy. And that seemed to me to be the major reason why change, or at least innovation, was able to happen in that pocket, whereas other faculties that had a long history that had to be changed, it was harder for that to happen. So we wanted to see, in contexts that did not have that novelty factor, whether change had been possible, and if so, what processes allowed that to happen. So that's our research questions are the same. What innovations are happening? Do any appear to have a significant impact? Within this, are there some that have more or less? And are certain interventions differentially effective for students with different backgrounds? We'll see if we're able to. This requires a large sample, which we have, but it remains to be seen if we have enough to really answer that one. And then why particular interventions are successful or not successful. What that says about how the process itself works. So, similar to the Rwanda study, this is a mixed method study, but the crucial difference is it's a longitudinal study. So unlike the cross-sectional design I did as a doctoral student, we are following the same students over time, which is why the maternity leave was handy with a late start on the data collection, because it's given us that longitudinal time. That's one major difference. The other major difference is from the outset, we were assuming we'd find these pockets, places where difference was happening. So it's a purposive sample of institutions. I mean, it was a purposive sample in Rwanda, but this purposive sample is I'm picking the 3 universities where the brightest students from secondary school go. This is quite a different purposive sample, and it's that we were choosing places that we knew they'd been trying to change pedagogy in a way that seems likely to improve critical thinking skills. So that's how we started. We started by trying to identify 2 or 3 research sites in each of our countries where we knew they'd recently implemented some sort of reform or developed in a certain way that we knew from the literature was likely to have a positive impact on critical thinking. And I have institutions, faculties, departments here, and that we were open to the level, and that we knew that there would be some whole institutions that were doing things, whereas in other places like at KIST, we might have a whole institution that was not, but one faculty or one department where we knew that they were. So we were open. And we identified these not through us sort of sitting in a room somewhere. We had stakeholder seminars in each context where we invited institutional representatives, ministry representatives, and others to feed into that process and give us ideas of where we should be looking. And as we suspected, we found pockets in each of the 3 countries. We then came up with a matched sample of control sites in inverted commas. I'll talk a little bit about the difficulty of doing that in the university context when I get to the list of institutions. But the idea was that we would have matched pairs, places where we know they're implementing something new, places where they're not necessarily implementing something new. And that ultimately gave us 16 sites. As I mentioned, Botswana is a very small higher education sector. It basically has it has 2 public universities and a very small number of privates, 4 I think at the moment. So we were trying to force a 3rd pair and it just didn't make sense. So we ended up with 2 pairs in Botswana and 3 pairs in the other 2 contexts, which gives us 16 sites overall. So what are we doing? There's really 2 components. So the first is this longitudinal analysis, and that's trying to answer that second research question, the impact question. So we had one big round of data collection in the 2015-2016 academic year. So we identified a random sample of incoming students. Random unless it was a small enough site that we could test all the students. So we had one faculty that only had 91 students in the program. We just tested the 91 students. Anywhere else, we pulled a random sample of between 100 and 120 students, depending. It administered this critical thinking test to them when they were first years, as well as some other tools. And now, in this academic year, we're going back to test them again. So because of the way data collection worked in the first round, Ghana finished earlier than the other 2 countries did, so they've actually now finished their second round, whereas Kenya and Botswana are in the middle of their second round now, since we wanted to keep that exactly 2 years across the 3 country sites. And what we're going to be doing is difference in difference analysis. So just to give a sense, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this approach, but essentially it looks something like this. If we imagine that this is our critical thinking test ability, and this is time 1 and time 2, so this is 2 years ago and this is this year. In any matched pairs, you're likely to have averages that are different just at the beginning. So you're likely to have, maybe one is a slightly more selective institution, maybe one is not, so as a result, the incoming students at the more selective institution just naturally do better on the first test than the others do. The problem, if you don't do this sort of analysis, is if you don't have a baseline, if you just look at the end line and look at the difference between the scores, you're not factoring that initial difference in. You're just looking at a difference between the scores. Similarly, you could do a before and after design like this and say, okay, well, they got this score in the beginning and this score 2 years later, so it must be that the university has added that much value to their lives. But actually, if you did nothing, the students could improve just from living, maybe working, growing up 2 years. So we're actually assuming that if you lined up all 16 universities and tested them 2 years ago and did the same thing this year, that there would naturally be an increase for all the students, and that the increase would look something like this, between 0.1 and 0.2, between 0.1 and 0.2, and the same all the way up. That they're on a similar slope, you'd assume. By bringing in the purposive sample of places where they've done a reform, we're hoping that we'll see this, which is, let's say we have a matched pair here, control treatment. Instead of just moving at the same rate, that in the treatment they move faster. And this, crucially, is this bit is the bit that you can maybe attribute to what's happened in terms of pedagogy. So that's essentially what we're doing. We already have our baseline collecting the end line now, and what we hopefully will be able to do this summer, we definitely will be able to do this summer, is see if the places where they are implementing reform is actually having more of an effect on the critical thinking ability of their students. Alongside that, we are running a qualitative study because, of course, all that will tell you is if a particular reform has had an impact. Nothing to do with why it does, and certainly nothing to do with why it does not. Nothing to do with the how. So all of those questions we felt we needed to answer qualitatively. So there's two bits of the qualitative as well. In the 2 years when the students were off learning critical thinking skills, we did some qualitative work. So interviews with faculty, with administrators, with students, trying to get a sense, and the intervention sites, trying to get a sense of what was this reform, why was it brought in, how was it being understood by the stakeholders, were the faculty members themselves, did they feel they'd changed their practice, if so how, etc. We also did some observation in the intervention sites. In the control sites, it was slightly less targeted, but still trying to get a sense of how does teaching happen on this campus, what's going on in classrooms, what's going on in terms of student understanding of their own university education. So that's just finishing up now. And the last bit, so we'll be finishing data collection next month. So as of this summer, we'll be able to look at that first round of qualitative work and crucially the longitudinal analysis. And we have a little bit more time in the grant, and we're going to use that to follow up on any surprises. So what I mean by that is if there is a place that we know a reform was implemented, and from all the interviews it seemed like it was being implemented really well, everyone seemed to really understand it, there seemed to be real sort of excitement around it, and yet the students didn't improve at all. We want to be able to go back and try and figure out what's going on. Or if in a control site where we feel that everything's going business as usual, the students massively improved, we also want to know why. So next autumn, in our last 6 months of the grant, we're going to go back to any surprises to see what might be going on in those places. So the whole study sort of has this conceptual framework running it, and this comes out of the Rwanda study. So it's based on literature that we have from high-income Western contexts, but adapted at following the Rwanda work. In that this is the process we assume, these are the things that we assume are going on. These are the things that we're hoping to look at. So this is Alexander Aston in 1970 talked about college impact in terms of inputs, environment, and outcomes. It's actually quite a handy way to think about universities. So I'm using that as my general frame here. But essentially, if we start from the end point, which is we want students to improve in their critical thinking ability, and then we work backwards to think about the things that might impact that. So what we know from the literature, from other contexts, is it's academic experiences largely that can have a direct impact on critical thinking skills. They can also have an indirect impact by increasing student engagement. So we know that if students are more engaged with their learning, they're more likely to improve in their critical thinking skills. That's sometimes also talked about in terms of approaches to learning. Students who have deeper approaches to learning become more engaged with the content, and that tends to impact critical thinking. So it can be a direct or an indirect pathway. And these are some of the things from the literature we know. So as I mentioned already before, we have collaborative learning as something that can improve critical thinking. Also more active learning, so projects rather than just listening to somebody lecture. We know that there's something about the curriculum, so sort of a cohesive curriculum, a curriculum that's progressive and builds on each other, and crucially a curriculum that all the modules in the curriculum require you to use some sort of critical thinking skills, so you're not just taking one module over here, but you're using it across. We know there needs to be an appropriate level of challenge. This is the case for all learning, and that it needs to be difficult enough, but also supported, so that you're being challenged, but you're being supported to reach the new challenge. Something around assessment and feedback, so the need for open-ended assessment, sometimes different kinds of assessment and feedback on that assessment, so students know how they're expected to improve. And this is a phrase from one particular book on college impact, enriching educational experiences. Basically, this means things like internships, research projects, site visits, things to sort of put learning in context, I guess. So this is what we know from the literature in the US, the UK, etc., should have an impact both on student engagement and on improved critical thinking ability. And crucially, the architecture example tells us that this can work in an African context too, because these were the things that could be identified in architecture. They did have a cohesive and progressive curriculum. They had a very challenging assignments that were also very well supported, lots of active and collaborative learning, lots of open-ended in-person assessment, lots of feedback, etc. So all these things were happening, and we could see evidence of both of these things. So we had evidence from one context, and what we're hoping with this study is to see if there are other things that we need to add to this or take away in terms of how this works in different African contexts. Also added to it, the Rwanda bit though, is this. So we know crucially that teaching is something that people have opinions about, people have attitudes, people have teaching orientations. We know that individual lecturers see teaching in different ways. Some see teaching as a transmitting thing where I tell you something and you receive it. Others see teaching as a facilitation thing where I facilitate your learning. Those kinds of attitudes have a critical impact on how these kinds of academic experiences actually are implemented in the classroom. And that's where this adaptation piece was happening in the other 5 faculties, right? That these tick box things were also there in the other 5 faculties. But in terms of how they were actually being implemented, they were being changed due to individual lecturers' own attitudes and teaching orientations. But what we saw in the Faculty of Architecture was that something about the culture of the faculty in which they were working allowed this to have less of an impact on this. So when the entire culture was built around peer exchange, collaborative work, building the curriculum together, which was the case, there was something in the department that was ensuring that even those lecturers who might have come into the department, certainly some come into the department with very strong positive attitudes towards teaching, others less so, but that their attitudes changed as a result of being part of the culture and being part of different kinds of teaching experiences. And then the last bit, of course, is the student backgrounds themselves. We know from lots of literature that demographic backgrounds, prior educational experiences, all of that affects how students experience higher education, and we expect to see the same thing. Students themselves have attitudes towards learning that affect their interaction with the environment. And of course, students' own incoming critical thinking ability has an impact here too. So this is sort of guiding everything in that the longitudinal bit is trying to see if this is happening, plus trying to see if inputs are having any impact on this. And the qualitative bit is able to look at actually what's happening here and what's happening here. So, thought I'd stop for a minute, because critical thinking, lots of different ways you can define critical thinking, and why is it even a relevant thing to look at in the first place? Anyone who works in this area knows this is a concept that literally has as many definitions as it has theorists working on it. There's so many definitions in the literature. So, what is it that makes it critical thinking as opposed to other thinking? Is it the same as reflective thinking? Is it the same as all different kinds of terminology? Are they all the same? Is it the same as problem solving? Is it the same as, what is it? How do we know if someone's being sufficiently critical? At what point on the threshold is someone being enough critical for it to count as critical thinking? There's huge debates on these last two. Some people think it's a skill. Some people think it's a disposition or a way of being in the world. Others think it's both. Some are very clear that it's a general attribute. Others think it's absolutely not, and it's something that's discipline specific. So there's various ways you can define and conceptualize critical thinking. Ultimately, we went with a technical definition as opposed to a political definition. In Rwanda, there was a very clear reason why I did that, and that is that I wanted to be allowed to work in Rwanda and not didn't want anyone to think I was interested in whether students were interested in inciting revolution. But also, crucially, it's a technical definition that is underlying most university discussions of critical thinking. So we're using this definition, which is basically critical thinking as considering an issue from multiple perspectives, examining evidence and attending to information that may run counter to or disconfirm ideas, valuing claims that are backed up by appropriate and adequate evidence, reasoning objectively and dispassionately, arriving at informed judgments and decisions. So quite technical. Of course, there's more political definitions of critical thinking. But we went with this one because if you ask most university representatives about whether they foster critical thinking in their learning, most would say yes, and most are thinking about critical thinking like this. So we decided to meet the universities where they were, to see if this is how you're defining it, is it improving or not? And we're using Deanna Kuhn from Columbia University's sort of understanding of how critical thinking works, and that there's assumption that students from all different academic disciplines learn certain skills. They might take a different form in different academic disciplines, but they are similar enough across the disciplines that when students go out into the real world and are faced with what's called an ill-structured problem, which means basically a problem that doesn't have a correct answer, that students will use the same kinds of skills to address that problem, regardless of the discipline that they've come from. In that sense, it's a general attribute, but one that can be fostered in different ways in different disciplines, but in the real world will manifest in a similar way. So that's what we're using. And that's important because it underpins the assessment that we've chosen. So, as I mentioned, there's a university assessment that's been used in the US called the Collegiate Learning Assessment. It has various components to it, but one component is called a performance task. And what I did in Rwanda was adapt the performance task element only, because that was the part that seemed to be culturally adaptable and relevant for various cultural contexts. There's other tests of critical thinking which are multiple choice tests. Most of those I felt were absolutely not even slightly adaptable for different cultural contexts, because ultimately you'd be testing students' cultural knowledge more than anything else. Whereas the performance task gives them a simulation of something that students in any walk of life are likely to encounter when they graduate. So what the format is it asks students to imagine a real life scenario where they have a role to assume and a decision to make. And as I mentioned, it has to be an ill-structured decision, so it has to be something where there is no right answer. Then it provides students with 7 different documents with different kinds of information, evidence about the decision. And what you're assessing is how the students use the information to make a decision, not what decision they come to. Okay, so this is why this is very important to think about the definition. This is thinking about critical thinking in terms of use of evidence and balancing of various decisions. And of course, there's other things you could incorporate into a decision, but or a definition, but that's what we're looking at. So if you look at the Collegiate Learning Assessment, the performance tasks, the subject area of the performance tasks in the source test, I felt were going to be completely irrelevant for use in most African contexts. So one that they use often in the US version is about drug use and crime, and just the way it's talked about, it just doesn't have much resonance in any context that I know on the continent. So instead we made 2 versions of the task, one based on a question around malaria prevention and one based on a question around road safety, both of which are issues that are relevant to all 3 country contexts. And the reason we did 2 is that even though we assume that these are somewhat general skills that can be fostered similarly in different disciplines, we didn't want to end up in a situation where our test was privileging students who were studying a particular discipline. So if we gave a malaria prevention task to health students, they might have just done better on it, just because they're more familiar with it. So we designed the 2 tests, checked to make sure that the tests were basically working in exactly the same way, and then randomly distributed them in the sample so that we would have that bias distributed or mitigated a bit. So I'm not going to take you through all of this. I'm happy to share the slides, David, with anyone who wants afterwards, but this is a sample task. So if we take out the most important points, the point is they're told to imagine they're at an internship in the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, and their role is to assist the Chief Technical Advisor. We see that the government has a priority, which is to reduce the number of road fatalities by 30%, and they're trying to decide between 2 policies. One is to hire more police officers to enforce the speed limit, and one is to use breathalyzer tests to monitor drunk driving. And your task basically is to evaluate those 2 proposed policies. Okay? So obviously an ill-structured problem. There is no one way to reduce road fatalities in any country. And you have a decision to make between 2 policy choices. The malaria prevention one is exactly the same in format, just with a different issue. And then they have these 7 pieces of evidence. So one example is this is a newspaper article that basically suggests that this person is the one who argued for the breathalyzer tests, mentions that the person who owns the breathalyzer company is her husband. So important sort of, can students recognize bias in a decision-making process? That's one piece of critical thinking, perhaps. We also have some other types of evidence. So this is a sort of statistic here of the, actually this one's from malaria. So it's from the other version of the test, but you can see exactly the same thing in the road test version, where actually if you start to look through it, you can see that they're basically basing on, So I should have included the graph. There's also a graph that goes along with this. And if you only use the graph looks like there's a clear correlation between, yes, you increase alco-blow tests, and yes, the number of the road fatalities go down. But they have a number instead of a percentage that's not at all taking into consideration the size of the region. So these are the kinds of things that, if you look at them for enough time, and the students have 90 minutes to do this test, so plenty of time to look at these 6 pieces of evidence, we want to see, are they able to think about this when they apply the decision? And then there's a series of questions that guides them through it. And what they're being scored on is these main skills. So selection and application of appropriate evidence. So when they're answering these questions, are they referring to evidence that makes sense for the question that's being asked? So based on the evidence in all the documents, do you agree with this argument? Are they selecting the right pieces of evidence? Are they interpreting it correctly? Are they evaluating it? Are they analyzing the claim in a way that shows some thought? And then are they synthesizing the different claims and justifying their conclusions? The maximum score on our test was a 42 because we weighted these slightly differently. So these 2 we weighted a little bit more than this, but we wanted to see that students could do all of the above. And I should say, because it's an open-ended test, one of the biggest challenges for the research team was making sure we were all scoring consistently. So we did many rounds of moderation, but in the end we were. So we were able to apply our rubric in a consistent way across the sample. So that was the test. In addition to the test, in the first phase we distributed a demographic questionnaire just to get a sense of student backgrounds. We also distributed a survey of student approaches to learning, which I'll talk about in a minute. So essentially, at the incoming phase, we wanted to know what their incoming critical thinking ability was, what was their background in terms of prior educational experience, socioeconomic background, etc., and also what was their incoming approach to learning. 2 years later, as in now, they're taking the test again. Obviously don't need to take the demographics again, but this time they're completing a questionnaire about the kinds of academic experiences they've been exposed to at university, and they're taking the approaches to learning questionnaire again to see if also that might have changed over time. I wanted to also take a minute to talk about the approaches to learning one, because this was the one that worried me the most. So approaches to learning have been measured through something called the Student Process Questionnaire, which was developed by a team at University of Hong Kong in 2001. It's been applied in various cultural contexts, but it had never been used in Africa before. And basically, it's a series of 20 questions that are supposed to get at whether students have a generally deep or a generally surface approach to learning. There's all kinds of critiques about that binary and about whether that's really the most helpful way to look at it. But it seemed like it was important to at least have some sort of measure of motivation and approach to learning in our analysis. So if a student who is a deeper approach would be likely to tick yes, or it's a sometimes, always, never kind of a question. They're likely to say they always or sometimes do these kinds of things. I come to most classes with questions in mind I want answering. I look at supplementary readings when suggested by my lecturer. I revise important topics until I understand them completely. I find that studying academic topics can at times be as exciting as a good film. Surface, I aim to spend the minimum time necessary to pass my classes. I focus only on materials that are distributed during class. I see no point in learning material which is not likely to be in the exam, and I generally restrict my study to what is specifically assigned, as studying additional material is unnecessary. So gives a pretty clear map of different approaches. I was concerned about respondent bias. I thought, for sure, when you distribute this to a group of students, they're going to tick the things they think they're supposed to tick. No, in fact, that did not happen. This is a weird looking chart, but essentially what you would expect is for the responses to load on what's called 2 factors, which means basically you'd expect a student who is largely one way or the other would mostly have questions in one category and not the others, or vice versa. And in fact, it fell exactly on the way you would expect from the designers of the instrument. So students were responding accurately in terms of reflecting their own behavior as well as attitudes. And importantly, it was mapping the way that Biggs et al. Suggests that it should. So I suppose one contribution of this study is going to be this is the first time this instrument's been used in any African context, and it seems to be at least potentially valid. This was the pilot results, I should say. It's initial exploratory.
Can I ask, is that internal consistency in their responses? Or are you saying that's a consistency with something else to do with their academic performance, or so the kids who say I aim to strictly to pass are getting sort of 50 to 55% or whatever the pass mark is, and the kids who say I aim to master this are getting 80, 85%, or
so it's not
about their internal responses that they consistently tick the
it's that.
I'm conscientious or I'm not conscientious.
It's that, and I should have brought the alpha score, but the alpha score was very high. It was something like 0.9 in the individual scale. So yeah, you want to see consistency, that students are generally ticking positive to some and negative to some in a way that's consistent, and they were. But also in terms of looking at the factors across the sample, it was coming up consistency. So no, not in terms of correlation with anything else, just in terms of internally how it's working as an instrument. Because obviously we needed to pilot all of these things. So the actual critical thinking assessment, the big adaptation process was between the US version and my study in Rwanda. There wasn't much of adaptation that needed to happen between the Rwandan version and the 3 versions we used in the 3 country contexts, but we did pilot them and did quite an extensive, first of all, just talking through the responses to the tests with groups of undergraduate students, but also distributed it to a small group to make sure that they were responding in the way we expected them to. And we did the same with all of those surveys that I mentioned as well. And this was the pilot results on the SPQ. So then in terms of who we worked with, so I mentioned that we had these stakeholder seminars to try and identify sites. So these, just to give you a sense, we are not naming our institutions for obvious reasons. There's reputational risk here. So I'm not saying which universities, but we worked with, as I mentioned, 2 interventions in Botswana and 3 each in Ghana and Kenya. And just to give you a sense of the spread of who was involved, both in terms of types of institution and in terms of intervention. So as you can see, we have quite a few that are implementing problem-based learning. That was their reform. And with there are different academic disciplines, but all with the same premise. So there were, let's see, 3 with problem-based learning. Quite a few also with community placements, where students were placed out in the community to try and apply their learning in different ways. You can imagine that would also improve critical thinking skills. We had quite a few with an explicit staff development or academic development program that was focused on more reflective teaching, the kind of teaching that is likely to have an impact on student critical thinking skills. One institution had a critical thinking module along with that. And one whole institution in Ghana really was kind of an outlier in itself, in that it has, its whole ethos is about improving critical thinking. So students take lots of liberal arts modules, there's community placements, and there's staff development. So these were the interventions that were identified by the stakeholders, and as you can see, a range. So we had privates and publics in all 3 institutions. In terms of the publics, sometimes was a flagship, sometimes was more of a regional or a STEM-focused public. And as you can see, we only actually had 2 interventions that were whole institution interventions. All of the others we went with a faculty where they were implementing things within their school or faculty. And then we paired them. And now the pairing part is messy. So Kane, who works on in the research team with us, has done a lot of work with primary schools. And he's used to matching schools. And he's like, wow, universities are a lot harder to pair. Because with a school, you can say, okay, we have exactly the same sort of community demographics. We have exactly the same kind of staff to student ratio. You're starting with just fewer options in a university sector, so finding an exact match is difficult. So these are not exact matches, but they're pretty close matches. So for instance, the faculty in Ghana within a STEM-focused public institution, we paired that with a faculty within the same institution, so at least we knew all the institutional characteristics were the same across the 2, but one had this reform and the other didn't, and we paired it with a discipline that was similar enough that we thought in terms of academic discipline it's similar, in terms of institution it's the same, but the difference really is the pedagogy. Others, this is the whole institution. We obviously had to pair it with a whole institution that was similar in various important respects, like also private, also fee paying, so that says something about the kinds of students that can afford to go perhaps, etc. So sometimes it was pairing faculties within the same institution. Sometimes it was finding a faculty of the same discipline within another similar institutional type. So those were our matched pairs. And as I say, we just now are starting the 2nd round. You'd think we'd at least have data from the 1st round, but actually it was incredibly difficult to clean all the data, score all of the tests. It took a lot longer than we expected it to. So what we have is the very, very beginning, which is we know something about how the students did on the test. which is again not great. So if you think about the score here, the max is 42. These are averages. The averages are not fantastic, and in some institutions quite poor. But at least this is incoming students, as opposed to the Rwanda sample where we're talking about fourth-year students. These are first-year students, so maybe it's not that surprising that they're not doing all that well with this somewhat difficult test. Some outliers. Here we have a flagship public in Botswana, where the flagship, you expect students to do pretty well. That's the students who do the best in secondary school make it to the flagship, so that's a pretty good average. This private school in Kenya, not at all a good average. So I guess the first headline is relatively low overall. The second headline is variation between the institutions and variation between the pairs. So these are the pairs are in order here. So you can see incoming skills as we expected, not the same in the pairs. Sometimes, this is pretty close, but most of them, that's pretty close, most of them are not, which is why it's good that we're doing the difference in difference. Because if you were to compare these students at the end and then say anything about what the university had done to them, doesn't tell you much because they were coming in with very different incoming skills. The other thing that's important to say that's not reflected here is you have variation within. So you always want to check and be sure some students are doing well on your test, otherwise your test is just too hard. But in all three contexts, I believe the maximum score in Botswana and Kenya was about somewhere between a 30 and a 35. The maximum score in Ghana was slightly lower, 25, but not horrendous. Not like the highest score was a 20 out of 42 or anything like that. So room for improvement over time, but some fluctuation. So that's what we know so far. The only other thing we've started to do, and this is exploratory analysis, this is just Ghana, is if we think about the approaches to learning, what we are assuming is there's going to be a correlation between those who do particularly well in the critical thinking test and those who show a deeper approach to learning. That would be the assumption. And indeed, when we look at the initial data, that does seem to be the case. So there is correlation in the way you would expect there to be. What remains to be seen, what we'll see in the longitudinal analysis, is whether the reforms that we're looking at, yes, we want to know if they improve critical thinking skills, but it would be also interesting to know if they move students' approaches to learning in a particular direction. So we'll be able to see that later this year. So I guess to close with the bit where I talk, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts. We have about a year left on our project, so it's going to be a very busy year. And that right now we're in the throes of finishing up that initial round of quantitative analysis. So still to be done, we still want to look at how different background variables impact that incoming critical thinking ability. We don't know much about that. And finish up this analysis with all three countries. We're also in the middle of the last round of data collection. So as of next month, we should have the second round complete. As I mentioned last year, we were working on the qualitative case studies. The individual country teams are doing most of that analysis, and they should be finished with that soon. And they're starting by looking at the data within institutions. And then with our involvement, we're going to be trying to see if there's any stories to be told at the national level or across the three countries. As of this summer, we'll be able to do this difference in difference, so see if there's been a change. And then we have the whole team coming together in July to look at that and decide on the final group of places where we want to go and check up and do some final analysis in the autumn term. And we should be finished by December, so there will be a big dissemination event in December in London. Anyone who's interested, give me your email. You're welcome to come along. And then we'll be returning to the three countries early next year to disseminate in the countries themselves. Because of the reputational risk, we have a slight challenge with dissemination in that we essentially have to disseminate at every university campus. Because if we held one big event, everyone would know who was involved, and they don't want that to be the case, especially if particular universities, and some of them in the sample certainly have sort of staked their reputation on the fact that this is what they do. And if their student results are not great, they are not going to want that to be aired publicly. So it's going to be a busy dissemination season in early 2019. So I'll open it to questions, but also just to give you my email. Happy to share these slides with David, but also answer any questions after today that anyone might have. But for now, I'm happy to take your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.